The spotlight fell on the announcer in the center ring. His magically amplified voice boomed through the tent like thunder. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, for our final performance this evening, Strickland's Circus is proud to present a thrilling spectacle unlike any you've seen before." He paused for a few moments, as if to let the audience soak in his words. "Everyone, give a warm welcome to the fearless queen of the center ring and her extraordinary winged beasts. I present to you Grace Hawkins." He dragged out the vowels of the name as the crowd broke into applause. A young woman in a short red dress with glittering gold accents entered the ring. Contrary to the popular bobbed style of the times, her long hair flowed free behind her like a dark cape. She flashed a radiant smile at the audience and raised both hands in a wave, then turned around and signaled to the 4 black-clad men standing just at the edge of the lit arena. They stepped forward into the light, and a wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Harvey sucked in a breath of his own and watched in awe as 2 griffins and a dragon were led into the ring. An actual dragon. He hadn't seen a dragon in any circus for decades, much less one as magnificent as this. The beast's body was roughly the size of one of the elephants that had performed earlier in the night, though with her tail and long neck, she was considerably longer and not quite as bulky. Orange, brown, and cream-colored scales covered her entire body, and each of her toes ended in a giant, hooked claw that could tear a man open in seconds. Thick ropes, presumably enchanted, bound her wings at her sides to keep her from flying off, but Harvey could imagine how powerful and majestic they might be, spread out to their full span. He looked down at his companion. The boy was equally mesmerized, if perhaps for other reasons besides sheer enjoyment of the spectacle. Harvey could practically see the cogs turning in his mind, plotting, scheming. It made him nauseous, but he shook the feeling off as he again turned his attention to the center ring. The trainer ran the beautiful creatures through a series of increasingly complex tricks. The griffins leapfrogged over each other in an almost complete circle around the ring, then took turns flying through a metal hoop the dragon held in its jaws. When they weren't performing some trick, they stood regally, eagle eyes surveying the crowd like predators considering their next meal. Their cat-like tails lashed back and forth, and occasionally they tucked their heads to preen the feathers on their chest and wings. The trainer placed 3 metal stools in the center of the ring and directed each beast to stand on one. The center stool looked much too small for the dragon to perch on, but she somehow managed to balance there with ease. All 3 animals then stood up on their hind legs and clawed at the air before them, as if to catch the applause of the delighted crowd. Harvey smiled in spite of himself. Such magnificent creatures. Seeing a dragon this close made the whole night worthwhile. Or it would have, were it not for his unfortunate part in the events that were sure to come. The boy elbowed him in the side. "There's our man. Time to go introduce yourself." "Can't it wait just a few more minutes? The show's almost over anyway."
"Do I need to remind you why we're here in the first place?"
Harvey sighed and reluctantly donned his fedora. "Where is he then?"
"By the entrance. The tall man in the cowboy hat."
They followed the truck's tracks, and the directions of a few helpful locals who'd seen Calico Thunder charge by, until they eventually reached a small pig farm on the outskirts of town. The dragon sat on her haunches just outside a wood slat fence, the fresh carcass of a young pig under one clawed foreleg. An irate man, presumably the pig farmer, shouted at the roustabout who'd driven the truck, but neither of them seemed willing to risk getting any closer to Calico Thunder in the middle of her meal. Jake approached the two men, Otto just a few steps behind him, and raised a hand to the farmer in greeting. "Good morning. I see our dragon's been stirring up some trouble."
"Trouble?" the farmer raged. "Trouble is when one of my hogs escapes the pen and goes missing. This is a disaster."
"I understand, sir, and I'm sorry about your animal. How can I make it up to you? Name your price." The man stopped fuming, and his scowl became one of contemplation rather than anger. He scratched at the stubble on his jaw with dirt-coated fingers.
"Well, a hog like that age, that size, he would have been at least worth $50.
Jake turned to Calico Thunder and took another look at the mangled pig carcass. It couldn't have even been half grown yet, and it certainly wasn't worth the full $50 the farmer had claimed. But if that was all it took to set the man at ease, he was more than willing to pay. He took out his billfold and counted the money, then handed it over along with 4 tickets to the circus. "For your trouble. If you can find it in your heart to forgive the old girl, maybe you'd like to come see the show today and see her in the ring. I reckon you'll find her more entertaining when she's not eating your livestock." The farmer chuckled a little as he stuck the money and the tickets in his pocket. Otto handed Jake a small jar filled with an opaque yellow substance.
"I'll get the truck ready,"
he said, and hurried to back it up into a more suitable position. Jake turned away from the farmer and opened the jar. He tried not to inhale through his nose, but he still caught a whiff of the acrid substance and gagged. Calico Thunder caught the scent, too. She stopped in the middle of tearing another strip of flesh from her pig and turned her broad head to Jake. The muscles in her back twitched, and the enchanted ropes binding her wings to her sides stretched a little as she shifted to scratch under her belly with one rear foot. He advanced at a steady pace, staying within line of sight of her one good, golden-yellow eye. The other had turned milky white from a cataract long before Jake had joined the circus, and the old girl tended to get annoyed when people snuck up on her from her blind spot. She let out a low, rumbling growl as he came closer, but it wasn't the threatening kind. Most people couldn't tell the difference, but he'd spent enough time around dragons, and this one in particular, to know what was a warning and what was just talk. Didn't mean he ever let his guard down completely, but he liked to think they had a bond of sorts, some kind of mutual understanding. They were kindred spirits, both former rodeo headliners who'd somehow wound up on a traveling circus train and found a way to make it work. He stopped at her side and ran a hand over her scaly hide, a mottled pattern of white, orange, and dark brown that had earned her the moniker. Beneath the scales, every inch of her body was pure muscle. Her jaws could crush a man's rib cage with little effort, and one swing from her spiked tail could knock him down and send him skidding across the ground with at least a few broken bones. But he wasn't afraid. Careful, always, but not afraid. She'd never snapped at him like she did some of the others, and besides, she'd never actually bitten anyone. She was just good at warning those she didn't like to steer clear. The ogres fell behind, leaving Jake alone beside the third man. No one said anything for a minute or two, but once they'd left the gathering crowd of townies behind, the man cleared his throat. "Let's talk business, shall we, Jake?
It is Jake, isn't it?
Yes. But like you said, I've got other work to get back to. So I'd appreciate it if you could get right to the point. A toothy smile peered out from beneath the man's mustache.
Of course. Your father was always a very direct man. Never wanted to waste any time. I respect that. As I said earlier, I'm actually here because of him. You see, Cliff owed me a rather significant amount of money. I understand he's gone now, and I hate to put this on you, but unfortunately, I can't just ignore a debt like this. Someone has to take responsibility.
Jake frowned. He'd paid all his father's outstanding debts, of which there had been many, when he took over the circus after Cliff's death. It was possible something had slipped through the cracks, but it was also possible this was just a scam. The three men looked respectable enough, but they still hadn't told him their names. And besides that, there was something off about them. Something Jake couldn't quite pinpoint, but it made him wary all the same. "You got proof?" he asked.
Of course.
The man reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a set of folded papers. He spread them open before passing them over. Jake scanned each page of what appeared to be a contract, signed and dated 5 years prior. He recognized his father's messy signature scrawled across the bottom of the last page. The second signature, clear and distinct, read, Vincent A. Burke. Vincent Burke? Is this some kind of joke? He looked up with narrowed eyes. Who are you? The man smirked. His facial features shifted, and a few seconds later, Jake was no longer staring at the unremarkable bearded gentleman he'd met at the ticket booth. This man was clean-shaven, with green eyes, dark hair, and a smile too wide for his face. A face Jake had seen in dozens of newspapers from the Midwest to the East Coast. Vincent Burke. High-profile Vegetarian mobster and one of the nation's most wanted criminals. Burke had only dropped his glamour for a few seconds before he conjured up the false appearance once more. The illusion was an effective disguise and helped explain how he'd managed to evade arrest on multiple occasions and escape prison whenever he was captured. The man had become a legend over the last few years, and now that legend was standing right in front of Jake, talking about an old business deal he'd made with his father. He gaped. "You'll want to take a look at that contract again," Burke said. Jake fumbled through the pages. When his eyes fell on the amount his father owed, his stomach plummeted. "You missing a decimal point in there somewhere?" Burke shook his head. "I'm afraid not. $400,000. You understand why I can't just let it go." He stopped walking and silently cursed his father. Even in death, Cliff continued to let him down. "I don't have that kind of money," he said. "I'm struggling to get by every month as it is, and I've got to take care of the animals and my employees first. I'd be happy to work out some kind of installment plan to repay the debt. Not that it would do much good." Even if he gave Burke every penny he earned, minus the circus's expenses, he'd be making payments until the day they put his body in the ground. "Well," Grace prodded. "Come on, out with it. You pulled me away from a very good hand in there, so whatever it is had better be important." He stuck his hands in his pockets, already bracing himself for her reaction. "You familiar with Vincent Burke?" She scoffed. "The mobster Vincent Burke? Sure, who isn't?" "Did you know my dad did some business with him?" She hesitated, then softly answered, I might have. Why?
Damn it, Grace! Didn't you think that might have been something I needed to know when I took over here?
What for? Cliff had already taken care of it. If you'd known, it would have just been another reason for you to hate him.
Jake ran a hand over his face. The man had been dead 2 years, and she still defended his honor like he was some kind of hero. For her, he had been. But Jake would never see him that way. I don't hate him, I just...
How did you find out about this anyway?
Bert came by the ticket booth today. Apparently, dear old Dad didn't take care of it after all. Turns out he owed the mob $400,000. In the dim moonlight filtering between the slats of the train car, Jake could just make out her wide eyes and open mouth.
That can't be right. He never would have...
She stopped and seemed to reconsider what she was about to say.
I didn't realize it was that bad.
$400,000. That's almost $500,000.
I know how numbers work, Jake.
How'd he let that happen?
It wasn't like that. It's not his fault.
He shook his head. Of course not. It was never his fault. The man was a saint in her eyes, the perfect father figure he had never been to Jake. He clamped his mouth shut to stop himself from hurling that same old, tired argument at her. Grace must have sensed his frustration. She took a step closer to him and brushed her fingers against his.
That's not what I meant. It's just... he tried, you know? He wasn't perfect, but he tried.
Well, if that's the best he could do, he was a bigger fool than I thought. She turned to the rough wood boards that fenced in the griffins. Trigger was scratching at the straw restlessly, but he strode over to Grace when she reached out a hand. He nuzzled her outstretched palm with his beak, and her eyes took on a faraway look as she stared back at the griffin. After a few seconds, she reached into her pocket and took out a small, folding knife Jake had seen many times before. The initials CS were burned into its wood handle.
Things got pretty bad 5, maybe 6 years ago, she said quietly, turning the knife over and over again in her fingers. We were broke. Cliff couldn't even keep the animals fed, much less pay everyone. And the banks wouldn't loan to him anymore because of all the debt he'd racked up. That's when he asked Burke for help. Strickland's circus would have been dead if he hadn't.
He borrowed too much, Jake growled. And from a man like Burke? What made him think that was a good idea?
I doubt he knew who he was dealing with. The Veterians hadn't made much of a name for themselves yet. Back then, Burke was just Burke. He was the last chance Cliff had to save all this, so he took it.
Anything to hold on to his precious circus. A familiar rage began to simmer inside of him. It was the same anger he'd felt at 10 years old when Bobby Parker told him his dad was a deadbeat who didn't want him. And again at 15, when he'd come home to his mom crying over an old family photo. It was the same anger he'd felt after learning he'd never ride dragons again, and begrudgingly went to work on his father's circus. He'd carried that anger with him his whole life, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with now. He clenched a fist and shook his head. It don't matter now. He's been letting me down since I was a kid, so it ain't like anything's changed.